Hello, we will now begin the graduate seminar for Week 11, focusing on Chapter 10, the Rhetoric of the Catholic Epistles, Part 2. Welcome back to our advanced doctoral seminar on the fascinating world of New Testament rhetoric. The title of our first slide today is Introduction to the Diverse Collection of Catholic Epistles. As we begin our deep dive into this complex subject, our primary textbook author begins by stating, as we have seen, the documents in the New Testament that are called the Catholic epistles are a diverse collection. When we hear the term Catholic epistles, it is absolutely essential to recognize that we are dealing with a later canonical designation, or retrospective title applied by the early Church Fathers, rather than an organic, localized collection. The word Catholic in this specific historical and literary context simply means general or universal. It was utilized as a convenient categorization tool to group together those apostolic writings that were not authored by the Apostle Paul and that seemingly lacked a single, geographically defined destination. Unlike Paul's letters to the Romans or the Galatians, which were addressed to very specific urban centers, these epistles were perceived to have a broader, more universal audience. However, as scholars of New Testament rhetoric, we must be deeply suspicious of this canonical packaging. While it served a vital theological and organizational purpose in the centuries following the composition of these texts, from a purely historical and rhetorical perspective, this grouping is highly artificial and profoundly misleading. It unconsciously forces modern readers to assume a level of theological consistency and stylistic uniformity that simply does not exist upon closer inspection. The document we call James, for instance, is a brilliant masterpiece of Jewish wisdom literature that is heavily infused with the stylistic conventions of Greco-Roman diatribe. 1 Peter, on the other hand, operates as a beautifully crafted baptismal homily, intricately utilizing the rich Old Testament language of diaspora and exile to comfort a persecuted minority. And the specific texts we are focusing our analytical lenses on today, namely the Epistle of Jude, 2 Peter, and the Johannine epistles, are equally distinct and idiosyncratic. They utilize completely different rhetorical species, drawing from the vast well of ancient persuasive techniques. Their strategies range from the fierce judicial condemnations and deliberative polemics found in Jude, to the soaring, reinforcing, and highly repetitive epideictic praise characteristic of 1 John. As advanced scholars, you must rigorously train your minds to strip away these later canonical labels. You must approach each of these ancient documents as a unique, self-contained rhetorical artifact. Each letter was born out of a very specific, localized historical exigence, an urgent crisis that demanded an immediate apostolic response. Furthermore, each text was crafted with precise, deliberate persuasive intent, utilizing the appropriate rhetorical tools to sway its intended audience. The staggering diversity of these epistles is a profound testament to the rich, multifaceted, and highly dynamic nature of early Christian discourse. Moving forward in our text, the author notes, in this chapter, we will look at 2 Peter, Jude, and the Johannine epistles, specifically 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. By isolating these specific documents for this week's analysis, we are setting up a fascinating and highly productive comparative study. On one side of the ledger, we have Jude and 2 Peter, two texts that are inextricably linked by profound literary dependence and a shared, vivid apocalyptic worldview. They represent a very specific trajectory of early Christian thought that heavily utilized Jewish pseudepigrapha and apocalyptic warnings to enforce strict communal boundaries. On the other side, we have the Johannine corpus, which functions as a self-contained literary universe with its own unique, highly developed vocabulary of light and darkness, truth and falsehood, love and hate. The Johannine community was dealing with an entirely different set of problems, primarily an internal theological schism regarding the physical incarnation of Jesus Christ. By examining these two very different blocks of text side by side, we will uncover exactly how early Christian leaders adapted their rhetorical strategies to combat vastly different types of existential threats. When the threat was moral laxity and the cynical mocking of eschatological judgment, as we see in 2 Peter, the rhetoric became incredibly harsh and judicial, utilizing the terrifying language of cosmic destruction. But when the threat was an internal philosophical departure from the foundational traditions of the community, as we see in 1 John, the rhetoric became highly repetitive, circular, and epideictic, constantly recalling the community to what they had heard from the very beginning. This comparative approach will vastly enrich your understanding of how flexible and potent early Christian rhetoric could be. Our primary task today is to meticulously unpack these distinct persuasive strategies, analyzing their structure, their appeals to ethos, logos, and pathos, and the specific historical crises that called them into existence. So, as we embark on this rigorous analysis, I want you to keep the concept of diversity at the absolute forefront of your minds. Do not harmonize these voices prematurely. Let Jude sound like Jude, let Peter sound like Peter, and let John sound like John. Only then can we truly appreciate the rhetorical genius of these early Christian communicators. The title of our second slide is Intertextuality and Kinship in 2 Peter and Jude. As we transition to the specific relationships between these documents, our textbook points out, it has often been noted that 2 Peter and Jude share a good deal of material and are closely related. When we encounter this kind of massive textual overlap in biblical studies, we are immediately thrust into the complex world of literary dependence, intertextuality, and ancient compositional practices. For the modern student, raised in an academic environment that strictly penalizes plagiarism, it can be quite jarring to realize that ancient authors freely borrowed, copied, and adapted the works of their predecessors without providing footnotes or citations. However, to understand the rhetoric of the New Testament, we must completely discard our modern, anachronistic notions of intellectual property. In the Greco-Roman educational system, particularly in the schools of rhetoric, the practice of imitatio, or in Greek, mimesis, was absolutely foundational. Students were rigorously trained to study the great masters, to internalize their stylistic forms, and to creatively adapt their arguments to suit new, contemporary situations. This was not considered theft, it was considered the highest form of literary homage and a perfectly legitimate tool of rhetorical amplification. When we apply this understanding to early Christian writers, we see that they were participating in this broader cultural practice. They readily adopted and adapted existing authoritative texts to address emerging crises within their own communities. The shared material between 2 Peter and Jude is one of the most glaring examples of this phenomenon outside of the Synoptic Gospels. We are not dealing with two authors who coincidentally happen to use the exact same rare vocabulary and identical sequential arguments. We are dealing with a direct textual relationship where one author sat down with the scroll of the other and deliberately incorporated its contents into a new rhetorical composition. Understanding this dynamic of imitation and adaptation is absolutely crucial because it allows us to see the rhetorical process in real time. By observing what a later author chooses to keep, what they choose to alter, and what they completely delete, we gain profound insights into their specific theological agenda and the unique persuasive goals they had for their specific audience. Continuing our analysis of this relationship, the text simply states, and are closely related. To dive into the specifics of this close relationship, the overwhelming consensus of critical scholarship is that the Epistle of Jude is the prior text, the original source document which the author of 2 Peter later incorporates and heavily edits. When we conduct a meticulous, side-by-side comparative rhetorical analysis of these two letters, the editorial hand of 2 Peter becomes glaringly obvious. Jude is a text characterized by raw, unfiltered apocalyptic energy. It is fierce, uncompromising, and deeply entrenched in the eschatological traditions of first-century Palestinian Judaism. 2 Peter, while maintaining the core polemical structure of Jude, engages in a fascinating process of rhetorical softening and Hellenistic refinement. The most striking evidence of this editorial process is how 2 Peter handles Jude's source material. Jude freely and directly quotes from non-canonical Jewish apocalyptic books, specifically the Assumption of Moses and the Book of 1 Enoch, using them as authoritative, inartificial proofs to terrify his audience into obedience. However, the author of 2 Peter deliberately strips these direct citations out of his version of the text. Why would a rhetorician do this? The answer lies in the shifting rhetorical situation of the early church. By the time 2 Peter was composed, the boundaries of acceptable, orthodox texts were beginning to harden. The wild, speculative apocalyptic literature that Jude embraced was becoming highly controversial, and was viewed with deep suspicion by many Hellenistic Christian communities. By omitting these controversial citations, the author of 2 Peter sanitizes the argument, ensuring that his own rhetorical appeals are not derailed by debates over the validity of obscure Jewish texts. This specific editorial choice demonstrates a high level of rhetorical awareness. The author of 2 Peter recognizes that what constituted a persuasive proof for Jude's localized Jewish Christian audience would actually damage his own ethos and alienate his broader, later audience. This close, intertextual relationship provides us with a magnificent laboratory for rhetorical criticism. It allows us to observe exactly how two different authors utilize the exact same foundational material, yet mold it to construct entirely different types of arguments, carefully calibrated for different historical moments and vastly different communities. Our third slide is titled The Johannine Epistles, Addressing Specific Communities and Schisms. Shifting our focus away from the apocalyptic warnings of Peter and Jude, our textbook author notes, the Johannine epistles, on the other hand, come from a specific community. When biblical scholars discuss the Gospel of John and the three epistles of John, we almost universally rely on the sociological and historical construct known as the Johannine community. Pioneered by giants in the field like Raymond Brown and J. Lewis Martin, this hypothesis suggests that the Johannine literature was not written for the church at large, but rather for a highly specific, somewhat isolated network of house churches that possessed their own distinct theological culture. This community was characterized by a tremendously high Christology, an intense reliance on the immediate guidance of the Holy Spirit, or the Paraclete, and a unique, highly specialized vocabulary. The rhetoric of this community is deeply insular. It relies heavily on shared, almost esoteric language and profound emotional bonds forged through shared trauma, likely an initial painful expulsion from the local Jewish synagogue. Because they felt alienated from the broader society, their internal language became a fortress. When you read the Johannine epistles, you are stepping into a closed conversation. The author does not need to build complex, logical syllogisms from the ground up, as the Apostle Paul often does when addressing the philosophically minded Corinthians or Romans. Instead, the author of 1 John relies on evocative keywords that function as emotional triggers for his specific audience. Words like abiding, knowing, truth, and love are loaded with massive theological weight and shared communal history. This constitutes a completely different rhetorical dynamic compared to the broad, public, deliberative rhetoric we might find in a Pauline letter addressed to a major metropolitan center. The Johannine rhetoric is the rhetoric of the inner circle, designed to comfort, sustain, and protect a marginalized group. It is an anti-assimilationist rhetoric, constantly reminding the believers that they are not of the world, and that the world cannot possibly understand them. Understanding this highly specific communal context is the absolute prerequisite for decoding the persuasive strategies employed in these three letters. Elaborating on the specific crisis facing this group, the text states that these letters, and address a particular schism. To truly grasp the rhetorical intensity of the Johannine epistles, we must understand the devastating concept of schism in the ancient Mediterranean world. A schism was never merely a polite academic disagreement over a minor point of theology. In a cultural context where your religious community was your primary source of identity, economic support, and social survival, a schism was a catastrophic tearing of the social fabric. It was a profound breach of fellowship, of koinonia, and a shattering of the sacred bonds of hospitality. The community that 1 John addresses has literally been ripped apart. Former friends, brothers, and sisters have abandoned the group over a bitter theological dispute. The rhetoric required to deal with this level of communal trauma is often deeply emotional, visceral, and unyielding. The author cannot afford to be nuanced or accommodating. To stop the bleeding and prevent further defections, he must utilize stark, absolute binaries. This is why the rhetoric of 1 John is characterized by a relentless ontological dualism. You are either walking in the light, or you are stumbling in the darkness. You are either possessing the truth, or you are believing a lie. You are either a child of God, or you are a child of the devil. There is no gray area, there is no middle ground. This kind of polarizing rhetoric functions beautifully to solidify the boundaries of the remaining, traumatized community. It provides absolute cognitive clarity in a time of bewildering confusion. By framing the Conflict in cosmic, dualistic terms, the author is aggressively reassuring the loyalists that they are securely on the side of divine truth. Simultaneously, this rhetoric serves to utterly vilify the secessionists, stripping them of any lingering legitimacy or appeal. By labeling the departed members as antichrists and false prophets, the author erects a massive psychological and rhetorical wall, making it emotionally impossible for the remaining believers to follow them out the door. The rhetoric of schism is the rhetoric of survival, utilizing every tool of emotional and theological polarization to protect the fragile remnant of the faithful. Welcome to slide number 4, titled Divergent Rhetorical Strategies, Polemic and Epideictic. To understand the mechanics of these texts, our author states, these documents are all rhetorical in nature, designed to persuade their audiences, but they use different rhetorical strategies to accomplish their goals. At this level of academic study, we must begin by firmly defining what rhetoric actually meant in the Greco-Roman world. Rhetoric was not, as we often use the term pejoratively today, empty speech or political spin. Rhetoric was the formalized, highly systematic art of persuasion. It was the foundational pillar of ancient education, and practically everyone in the ancient Mediterranean, whether literate or not, was a sophisticated consumer of oral rhetoric. They knew a good argument when they heard it, and they recognized the structural forms being deployed. The classical handbooks, written by masters like Aristotle, Cicero, and Quintilian, generally categorized all rhetoric into 3 primary species. First, judicial or forensic rhetoric, which was the language of the law courts, used to attack or defend someone based on past actions. Second, deliberative rhetoric, the language of the political assembly, used to advise a community on future courses of action, arguing for what is advantageous or harmful. And third, epideictic rhetoric, the language of the public forum or funeral, used to praise or blame a person or institution in the present moment, reinforcing shared societal values. The critical insight here is that an ancient author's choice of rhetorical strategy was never accidental, it depended entirely on the specific exigence, the urgent, presenting problem that desperately needed to be addressed. A crisis of blatant moral corruption and rebellion requires a vastly different persuasive approach than a subtle crisis of theological definition. A skilled early Christian rhetorician would seamlessly select the appropriate species of rhetoric, or blend them together, to perfectly match the emotional and logical needs of the moment. We see this dynamic perfectly illustrated in our texts. The textbook brilliantly contrasts these approaches, noting, Jude and 2 Peter are highly polemical, whereas 1 John is a homily or tractate that uses epideictic rhetoric to reinforce the boundaries of the community. Let us dive deeply into these 2 divergent paths. First, consider the polemical rhetoric of Jude and 2 Peter. In classical terms, this is often classified as vituperatio, or invective. The primary goal of invective is not necessarily to calmly debate the opponent's theological propositions point by point. Rather, the goal is to utterly obliterate the ethos, the perceived character and moral standing, of the opponent. Polemical rhetoric utilizes highly aggressive, exaggerated, and often stereotypical language to paint the adversaries as dangerous, irrational monsters. This is why Jude calls the false teachers brute beasts, waterless clouds swept along by winds, and wandering stars for whom the deepest darkness has been reserved. This is not polite theological discourse, this is a rhetorical carpet bombing designed to make the opponents so morally repugnant that the audience recoils in absolute horror. The aim is to create intense disgust and fear, motivating the community to violently reject the infiltration. Now, contrast this fierce, combative style with the epideictic rhetoric employed in 1 John. Epideictic rhetoric, the rhetoric of praise and blame, functions very differently. In 1 John, the author is not primarily engaged in a frontal assault on the departed heretics, they have already left the building. Instead, the author turns his rhetorical gaze inward, toward the traumatized remnant of the community. He uses epideictic language to lavishly praise the existing virtues of the believers, constantly reminding them of the beautiful, profound truth they already possess. He tells them they have an anointing from the Holy One, that they know the truth, and that the love of God is perfected in them. Epideictic rhetoric utilizes intense repetition, returning again and again to core themes like love, light, and obedience, to amplify their importance and cement them in the audience's mind. It does not argue for new information, it celebrates and solidifies established facts. By utilizing this soaring, reinforcing style of praise, the author of 1 John builds a massive psychological and theological fortress of shared values around his congregation. This epideictic strategy makes the warm, loving interior of the community look infinitely superior to the cold, deceitful darkness of the outside heresy, effectively persuading the believers to remain steadfast and loyal. Moving to slide number 5, we address the necessity of basic academic background. Before diving into the texts themselves, our author issues a methodological warning, before we turn to the rhetorical analysis of these documents. It is crucial at this juncture to explicitly discuss the symbiotic relationship between standard historical critical methodology and the specialized field of rhetorical criticism. There is a dangerous temptation among some students to view rhetorical analysis as a purely formalistic exercise, a kind of literary parlor game where we merely identify ancient tropes, label figures of speech, and diagram sentence structures in a vacuum. However, authentic rhetorical criticism can never be severed from history. To truly understand how a persuasive argument functions, one must deeply understand the gritty, real-world context in which it was deployed as a weapon. In the mid-20th century, the scholar Lloyd Bitzer revolutionized the field by defining what he called the rhetorical situation. Bitzer argued that rhetoric is fundamentally reactive, it is called into existence by a specific, urgent problem that can be modified by discourse. He identified three components: the exigence, which is the crisis itself, the audience, those who have the power to enact the requested change, and the constraints, the cultural, historical, and linguistic limitations placed upon the speaker. If we attempt to analyze the rhetoric of the Catholic epistles without firmly grasping their historical exigence, we strip them of their power. Without anchoring our analysis in history, we risk turning these ancient, highly dynamic, and desperately urgent texts into flat, abstract theological treatises. They were not written to sit quietly on a library shelf, they were shouted into the chaotic void of early Christian house churches to save souls and preserve communities. Therefore, historical background is not optional, it is the absolute prerequisite for doing serious rhetorical analysis. The text makes this explicit, stating, we must briefly consider their basic academic background, including questions of authorship, audience, and date. Let us carefully detail exactly why these three specific historical factors, authorship, audience, and date, are non-negotiable for our work. First, the question of authorship directly defines the rhetorical concept of ethos. Ethos is the perceived character, credibility, and authority of the speaker. A congregation will respond completely differently to a gentle plea from a beloved, aging founding pastor than they will to a fierce theological mandate from an unknown, traveling prophet. Establishing who is speaking, or at least who is claimed to be speaking, allows us to measure the weight of the authority being leveraged. Second, a rigorous historical analysis of the audience determines the available avenues for pathos, the emotional appeals, and logos, the logical arguments. A rhetorician must know their audience's fears, their values, and their intellectual background. For example, deploying a complex logical proof based on Jewish apocalyptic texts will only be persuasive if the audience actually views those texts as sacred and authoritative. If the audience consists of newly converted Greek pagans, that specific logical appeal will completely misfire. Finally, establishing the chronological date of a document defines the historical constraints and the cultural vocabulary available to the author. The Roman Empire was not static. The political and social pressures facing Christians in the year 60 were vastly different from the pressures they faced in the year 95. Knowing whether a text was written in the terrifying shadow of the Neronian persecution in Rome, or decades later during the insidious, creeping social ostracization of the Domitianic period, radically alters how we hear its persuasive appeals regarding suffering, endurance, and relationship to the state. In short, establishing the academic background builds the stage upon which the rhetorical performance takes place. Without the stage, the performance is incomprehensible. Slide number 6 focuses on the Epistle of Jude, identity and authorship. Looking at the very first verse of this intense document, the textbook notes, the letter of Jude claims to be written by Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. This refers to the brother of Jesus. The opening salutation of any ancient letter is prime real estate for establishing the author's ethos, and Jude's self-identification is a masterpiece of rhetorical positioning. Let's unpack the layers of this brief introduction. By explicitly invoking his familial kinship with James, the author is instantly aligning himself with the absolute bedrock of early Jewish Christianity. James, known as James the Just, was the undisputed, preeminent leader of the Jerusalem Church, a figure of massive authority and impeccable Jewish piety. By linking himself to James, Jude implicitly claims a derivative apostolic authority. He is speaking from the very heart of the Mother Church. Furthermore, history tells us that both Jude and James were actual, biological brothers of Jesus of Nazareth. Yet, look at the astonishing rhetorical choice Jude makes here. He deliberately suppresses his physical, blood relationship to the Messiah. Instead of proudly declaring himself the brother of Jesus, which would seem to be the ultimate trump card in any theological debate, he chooses the title servant, or more accurately translated, slave, doulos, of Jesus Christ. This substitution of a physical boast for a spiritual designation constitutes a profound rhetoric of humility. In the honor-shame culture of the ancient Mediterranean, to publicly lower one's own status is a powerful way to demonstrate supreme piety and devotion to the Lord. This calculated posture of humble servitude establishes an incredibly strong moral ethos for the author, which paradoxically makes his subsequent, ferocious condemnation of the arrogant false teachers even more striking and persuasive. His humility validates his righteous anger. Assessing the historical reality of this claim, the author concludes, it is unlikely that a pseudonymous writer would have chosen the name of such an obscure figure in the early church, so the traditional attribution to Jude is highly probable. To understand this conclusion, we must introduce the historical criterion of multiple attestation and understand the fundamental logic that governed the practice of pseudonymity in the ancient world. When ancient authors set out to write pseudepigrapha, that is, when they decided to write a document and falsely attach someone else's name to it, they operated according to a very specific, pragmatic logic. The entire goal of a forgery is to guarantee that the document will be widely read and universally accepted as authoritative. Therefore, forgers almost exclusively chose the names of massive, foundational, legendary figures. They wrote in the name of the Apostle Peter, the Apostle Paul, Moses, Enoch, or Abraham. Choosing a relatively obscure figure like Jude makes absolutely no sense from the perspective of a forger. Jude plays almost no role in the expansive narratives of the Book of Acts, and he is barely a footnote in the canonical Gospels. He simply did not possess the widespread, legendary status required to propel a forged document into broad circulation across the empire. Therefore, the very obscurity of the name Jude is the strongest possible argument against this text being a later, 2nd century fabrication. This gives modern scholars a remarkably high degree of confidence in the historical authenticity of the authorship. This is thrilling, because it means that when we read the Epistle of Jude, we are not reading a later, idealized reflection on the early church. We are encountering a genuine, first-generation Jewish Christian rhetorical artifact. We are hearing the raw, unfiltered, and deeply passionate voice of the earliest Jesus movement, battling for its theological life in the trenches of the 1st century. Slide 7 explores Jude's genre, audience, and apocalyptic influences. Regarding the physical format and dating of the text, our book states, the letter was likely written in the mid to late 60s of the Common Era. It is not a standard Hellenistic letter but rather a homily or sermon sent in letter form. This distinction regarding genre is absolutely vital for conducting accurate rhetorical criticism. We must discard the mental image of a solitary individual sitting silently in a study reading the Epistle of Jude. In the 1st century context, because early Christian leaders and apostles could not be physically present in every city at once, they creatively adapted the standard Greco-Roman epistolary form to serve as a powerful surrogate for their physical presence and their dynamic oral preaching. Jude is best categorized as a letter essay or a written homily, what the ancients called a word of exhortation. It is a document explicitly designed and engineered to be performed, to be read aloud with passion and inflection before a gathered assembly of believers. When we analyze the Greek text of Jude, this oral dimension becomes undeniable. The text is packed with rhythmic cadences, extensive use of alliteration, and a remarkably consistent use of triads, presenting ideas and descriptions in sets of 3. These are not merely literary flourishes, they are classic mnemonic devices and performative markers designed to help the public reader deliver the speech powerfully, and to help the listening audience remember the core message. Understanding Jude as a performed, fiery sermon radically shifts how we measure its rhetorical impact. We must imagine the volume rising, the tempo accelerating, and the emotional intensity filling the room as the reader unleashes Jude's devastating critique. Moving to the specific persuasive tools Jude uses, the text notes, the audience was likely Jewish Christian, given the author's heavy reliance on Jewish apocalyptic traditions, including 1st Enoch and the Assumption of Moses. This observation brings us to the crucial rhetorical concept of inartificial proofs, or external evidence used to anchor and support a logical argument. A master rhetorician knows that an external proof is only effective if the specific audience being addressed actually believes that the proof is authoritative. Jude builds his case by explicitly utilizing texts that his specific, localized Jewish Christian audience deeply revered, even though these specific texts were later excluded from the finalized canonical Bible by later generations. Jude's direct, unapologetic quotation of the book of 1st Enoch is a rhetorical masterstroke of apocalyptic persuasion. By invoking Enoch, Jude conjures a terrifying, vivid vision of imminent cosmic judgment, of myriads of holy angels descending to execute wrath upon the ungodly. This overwhelming imagery serves to violently shock the audience out of their spiritual lethargy and complacency. Apocalyptic rhetoric is fundamentally designed to be unsettling. It is intrinsically dualistic and desperately urgent. It violently strips away any comfortable middle ground, any possibility of compromise. It forces the listening audience to look at the terrifying reality of divine judgment and make an immediate, absolute choice. You must align either with the path of the righteous, which leads to eternal life, or the path of the corrupt false teachers, which leads to the blackest darkness. By leveraging these powerful apocalyptic traditions, Jude creates an atmosphere of extreme spiritual crisis, effectively coercing his audience to reject the dangerous infiltrators and cling tightly to the faith delivered once and for all to the saints. Slide 8 brings us to 2 Peter, testamentary genre and pseudonymity. Addressing the presentation of this text, the author points out, 2 Peter presents itself as a testament of the Apostle Peter. To understand the psychological and emotional power of this document, we must first recognize the specific literary genre it consciously adopts, the Testament, or the farewell discourse. This was a highly developed and widely recognized literary form in both Second Temple Judaism, seen in works like the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, and in early Christianity, perhaps best exemplified by Paul's emotional farewell address to the Ephesian elders in the Book of Acts. The testamentary genre follows a very specific rhetorical script. A great, venerated leader gathers his closest followers around his deathbed. Knowing that his departure is imminent, he offers his final, most crucial warnings, he predicts future crises and the arising of false teachers, and he imparts his enduring, summarizing wisdom. In the ancient world, it was universally believed that the words of a dying person, particularly a holy patriarch or an apostle, possessed unparalleled gravity, ultimate sincerity, and even prophetic truth. A dying man has no reason to lie and nothing left to gain from worldly deception. By deliberately adopting this highly charged genre, indicating that the putting off of his body will be soon, the author of 2 Peter immediately secures the rapt, breathless attention and the emotional vulnerability of his audience. Before he even makes his first logical argument, he has established a profoundly somber, urgent, and unassailable authoritative tone that will carry the weight of the entire discourse. However, this brings us to the most controversial aspect of the letter. It is widely regarded by critical scholars as a pseudonymous document written in the early 2nd century. We must tackle the incredibly complex and often uncomfortable issue of pseudonymity head-on. In the modern world, we instinctively view writing a document and signing someone else's name to it as an unethical forgery, a deliberate act of deception. But we must carefully evaluate how this practice functioned within the Greco-Roman and Jewish educational and literary systems of late antiquity. In the ancient schools of rhetoric and philosophy, writing in the name of a revered, deceased master was sometimes recognized as a legitimate, advanced literary exercise. It was viewed as a profound way of honoring a living tradition, or as a necessary mechanism for applying a great master's foundational teachings to a brand new, unforeseen situation. A devoted disciple might feel they were genuinely speaking the mind of their master. We must grapple with whether the original audience of 2 Peter would have immediately recognized this as a transparent literary device, a pious fiction, or if it was indeed intended to be taken literally as Peter's own handwriting. Regardless of the endless modern debates over the ethics of this practice, we must clearly understand its rhetorical function. The rhetorical purpose of pseudonymity in this specific instance was to borrow the massive, established, unshakable ethos of the great apostle Peter to combat a virulent, new theological threat. The specific threat facing this community was a rising, cynical skepticism regarding the second coming of Christ, the parousia. By wrapping his defense of the second coming in the commanding voice of the chief apostle's final testament, the author deploys the heaviest possible rhetorical artillery to crush the skepticism of the mockers and reassure the wavering faithful. Slide number 9 is titled 2 Peter, Stylistic Discrepancies and Petrine Connections. Elaborating on why scholars doubt direct Petrine authorship, the text states, they point to its stylistic differences from 1 Peter, its reliance on Jude, its reference to a collection of Paul's letters, and its concern with the delay of the parousia. It is important to systematically unpack these four major pillars of the critical argument. First, comprehensive stylistic and linguistic analysis reveals that 2 Peter utilizes a much more grandiose, elaborate, and sometimes convoluted Asianic style of Greek, which stands in stark contrast to the elegant, polished, and heavily Septuagint-influenced Greek of 1 Peter. It is difficult for many linguists to imagine the same Galilean fisherman producing both texts. Second, as we have already discussed, the heavy, almost verbatim reliance on the Epistle of Jude strongly suggests a later author who is engaged in adapting and editing earlier, existing material. Third, 2 Peter contains a fascinating reference to the letters of Paul, referring to them collectively and even appearing to elevate them to the level of other scripture. This implies a later historical period when the Pauline corpus was beginning to be collected, circulated, and recognized as canonically authoritative, a process that took decades to solidify. Finally, the central crisis of the letter, dealing with mockers who sarcastically ask, "Where is the promise of his coming?" points clearly to a second-generation problem. The initial, burning expectation of Christ's immediate return has faded, the first generation of apostles and fathers has died, and a crisis of delayed eschatology has set in. All these historical and literary factors combine to create a rhetorical situation that feels fundamentally different and significantly later than the mid-first century context of 1 Peter. Yet, the debate is not entirely closed. The textbook offers a vital counter-perspective. However, a case can be made for a Petrine connection, perhaps written by an amanuensis or close associate shortly after Peter's death, utilizing his final instructions and incorporating Jude. To give this counter-argument its due, we must present the historical reality of ancient scribal practices. The use of an amanuensis, a highly trained, professional secretary, was absolutely ubiquitous in antiquity, particularly for individuals who were not formally educated in elite Greek composition. An amanuensis was rarely just taking word-for-word dictation, they could be granted immense literary freedom to draft, structure, and polish a document based only on the general outlines or thematic instructions provided by the author. This well-documented historical reality could easily and elegantly account for the radical stylistic shift between 1 and 2 Peter. Peter simply utilized two very different secretaries with different linguistic backgrounds. Furthermore, we must consider the possibility of posthumous publication. If a close, trusted associate or a school of disciples compiled Peter's final oral teachings and warnings shortly after his brutal martyrdom in Rome, and then wove them together with the powerful arguments found in Jude to address a sudden crisis, the resulting document would still possess a profound, albeit derivative, apostolic authority. It would be Peter's theology, channeled through the pen of his followers. This highly nuanced understanding of ancient authorship and secretarial practice forces us to evaluate the rhetoric of 2 Peter with greater sophistication. We must not lazily dismiss it merely as a cynical forgery. Instead, we should analyze it as a complex, potentially collaborative effort to desperately preserve, adapt, and urgently apply sacred apostolic tradition to save a community struggling with doubt and the terrifying passage of time. Slide 10 introduces the Johannine epistles, anonymity, authorship, and origin. Turning our attention to the final group of texts, the book observes, the 3 Johannine epistles are anonymous, although 2nd and 3rd John identify the sender as the elder. This brings us to a truly fascinating rhetorical choice. While Paul begins almost every letter by aggressively defending his title as an apostle of Jesus Christ, and Peter's name is heavily leveraged in the texts we just discussed, the author of 1 John never once names himself. He operates in complete, deliberate anonymity. This is not an oversight, it is a calculated rhetorical strategy. Instead of relying on an institutional title or a famous name, the author relies entirely and exclusively on the massive, unassailable ethos of direct, physical eyewitness testimony. He opens his treatise by declaring that he is proclaiming that which we have heard, that which we have seen with our eyes, that which we have looked at and our hands have touched. In a debate over whether Jesus was a real physical human being, claiming to have physically touched him is the ultimate, undeniable proof. In the shorter letters of 2nd and 3rd John, he adopts a different tactic, utilizing the title the elder, or in Greek, presbyteros. This is not a broad, universal title like apostle, it is a title of profound, localized, and highly personal authority. It suggests a patriarchal, deeply relational, almost grandfatherly leadership style, rather than a rigid, institutional, or jurisdictional one. The rhetoric flows not from a posture of legal command, but from a posture of pastoral love, intense personal history, and paternal authority. This creates a deeply intimate, compelling, and emotional persuasive dynamic that is very different from the forceful decrees of Paul. Establishing the origins of these texts, the author writes, they share a common vocabulary and theology with the Gospel of John and likely originated from the same Johannine community, probably in Ephesus around the end of the 1st century. We must deeply explore the rhetorical implications of this Ephesian provenance and this unique, shared Johannine vocabulary. The city of Ephesus at the very end of the 1st century was a massive, bustling metropolis, a boiling cauldron of philosophical speculation, mystery religions, and imperial cults. To survive in this volatile, syncretistic environment, the Johannine community had turned inward, developing a highly specialized theological language, a spiritual dialect of sorts, that tightly bound them together. When the author of these epistles utilizes terms like walking in the light, possessing the truth, or abiding in the vine, he is not using generic religious metaphors. These words are loaded with highly specific, localized communal history and immense theological weight, they are the passwords of the community. Rhetorically speaking, utilizing this dense insider language acts as a powerful sorting mechanism. It immediately establishes profound solidarity and comfort among the loyalists who speak the dialect, wrapping them in familiar truth. Simultaneously, it actively alienates and isolates the schismatics who have abandoned the true meaning of these words. By weaponizing their own community's vocabulary, the elder crafts these letters into incredibly effective, laser-focused tools for theological consolidation and rigorous boundary maintenance. Our final slide, number 11, is Theological Crisis and House Church Politics in the Johannine Epistles. Detailing the exact nature of the emergency, the text reveals, 1 John is a homiletic tractate written to reassure a community that has just experienced a painful schism. The secessionists apparently held Docetic views, denying that Jesus Christ had come in the flesh. We must grasp the profound trauma of this schism and the insidious nature of the heresy known as Docetism. Docetism derives from the Greek verb dokion, which means to seem or to appear. Driven by a pervasive, underlying Hellenistic philosophical bias that viewed the physical, material world as inherently corrupt and the spiritual realm as pure, these false teachers argued that the divine Son of God could not possibly have taken on corrupt human flesh. Therefore, they claimed, Christ only seemed to have a physical body, he was essentially a divine phantom. While this might sound like an obscure academic debate to modern ears, it was devastating to early Christian theology. If Christ did not possess real human flesh, then he did not shed real human blood, and the entire mechanism of the atonement and human salvation collapses. The author of 1 John combats this terrifying heresy not merely with dry, logical argumentation, but with intense, visceral, epideictic rhetoric. He aggressively emphasizes the raw, physical reality of Jesus, demanding acknowledgement of the flesh and blood of the Incarnation. But the primary, overarching rhetorical goal of 1 John is pastoral reassurance. The community is shell-shocked and grieving the angry departure of their former friends. The author deploys soaring, beautiful, comforting rhetoric to passionately assure the remaining, confused members that they possess the true Spirit, the true anointing, and authentic fellowship with God the Father. It is a brilliant rhetorical balm applied to a gaping communal wound. Finally, looking at the shorter letters, the author notes, 2 John is a brief letter warning a house church not to show hospitality to these false teachers. 3 John is a personal letter to Gaius, commending his hospitality and warning against an overbearing leader named Diotrephes. Here, we witness a fascinating shift. We transition from the soaring, abstract theological heights of 1 John, plummeting directly into the gritty, practical, deliberative politics of the ancient house church network. In the Greco-Roman world, the entire Christian missionary enterprise relied utterly and completely on the sacred institution of hospitality, or xenia. Because there were no church buildings or safe public spaces, traveling teachers depended on local believers to open their homes, provide food, and offer financial support for the next leg of their journey. To deny hospitality was to sever the lifeblood of a minister's work. 2 John uses stark, deliberative rhetoric to demand a brutal, uncompromising boundary: you must absolutely refuse to let the docetic false teachers into your homes. If you feed them, you participate in their evil work. It is a call for total ideological quarantine. 3 John, however, reveals the dark, dangerous side of this decentralized system. It shows us a situation where a rogue local leader, named Diotrephes, has successfully weaponized the rules of hospitality to consolidate his own dictatorial power. Diotrephes is refusing to welcome the elders' legitimate emissaries, and he is excommunicating anyone who tries to help them. The rhetoric in 3 John is deeply political and highly tense. The elder is attempting to navigate the incredibly fragile balance of power, patronage, and authority within these scattered house churches, trying to support his ally Gaius while preparing to confront the rebellion of Diotrephes face to face. These three letters together provide us with an unparalleled, multidimensional view of how early Christian leaders utilized every rhetorical tool at their disposal, from theological poetry to hard-nosed political maneuvering, to guide and protect their fragile communities.